So it is a pleasure to be here. Very thanks to Marwan for the hosting. It's my first time in Abu Dhabi, so I just arrived yesterday. Sorry for my voice. I'm recovering from a flu that I picked during this trip, but I'll try to be as loud as possible. Again, pleasure. Thank you for your time. This is joint work with my former students, Li-Fang Lai and Praveen Gubala. Li-Fang now is at UC Davis and Praveen is at Facebook. And my current postdoc, Dr. Ting-Hui Wang, who just finished at Purdue and joined us at Sydney. In the original title in the advertisement, I had security AI and quantum sensing, but while working on the presentation, I found out that it's too ambitious to cover that in an hour, so I got rid of the third. But the basic gist of the talk is actually information theory provides a set of really cool, rigorous tools that can be very useful in those three applications. And there is a very interesting connection that hopefully we are gonna explore today. So the nature of the talk will be a little bit tutorial to introduce the basic concept and cover some of our recent results. And the main highlight actually will be toward the end, where we'll combine those things together. We'll see how information theory can allow us to build tools in machine learning that can actually be extremely useful in cybersecurity. So what do we mean by security? It's a really, security means a lot of things, and the way people look at it is on the foundation of primitive. So the main primitive that I'll spend a significant amount of time talking about today is confidentiality, which is a very simple case where two legitimate users are trying to exchange a message in the presence of an eavesdropper, and they try to hide that message from. Now, we want to be very careful not to confuse confidentiality with privacy, because privacy is a much bigger notion, because while the eavesdropper may not sometimes be able to get the message, they may get more information about the identity, for example, of the transmitter, the receiver, or some other things like which platform they are using. And we're going to come back to that in the multi-layer security work that we're currently doing. Now, there are other things in security, like data integrity, authentication, many other things, which we will not cover today. So when people hear cybersecurity in general, I don't think the first thing that comes to mind is information theory, right? That's not really the first thing that comes to mind. A lot of things come to mind, but that's not the first. However, I will claim today and try to convince you a little bit with the limited time that actually Shannon is the founder of the most rigorous notion of security, at least from a confidentiality perspective. So historical background, which is quite appropriate given that actually the Arabs actually have played a huge role in security. In fact, I think Al-Kindi in 800 was the first to publish on using relative frequency in decrypting or figuring out messages. But what do we, and that's confidentiality, this has been a very old problem. So it's not really recently only we start thinking about this. It's a very old problem. And this is an example that goes back to Julius Caesar, which was, I think, the first documented shift cipher. So when he wanted to send messages to his generals in the field, he would write the message and then take every letter and shift it by a fixed amount of digits and then rewrite it this way and send it to the field. So if you shift by 2, for example, then every A will become a C, every B will become a D, and then you take it this way and then you write the new one and you send it to your general. And the fundamental question now, how is this secure or not secure? What do you think? It is not? Why? This, by the way, this took people a long time to decide, actually, whether it's secure or not. Just that fundamental question took many years, many hundreds of years. Why do you think it's not secure? Because it's fixed. Right, because, but yes, it's, so if you know that it's a shift cipher, then it's very easy because you have only 24 shifts that you can try out, 25 in English language, and then you can try all of them and figure which one. If you don't know it's a shift cipher, if no one told you it was a shift and you only see the cipher text, that's not easy to figure out, right? Because it may actually not look, it's not easy compared to that. I mean, you could use relative frequency and other stuff, but if you don't know that it's a shift cipher, Now, as obvious as it is to you right now, it took many years for us to actually formulate that principle. So the Kerckhoff principle, which is much more recent than the Caesar cipher, was the first time where this was formally defined, which was saying that in order to decide whether something is secure or not, you have to first assume that the adversary knows the algorithm that you're using. And given that they know the algorithm, you have to decide whether secure or not based on what's called a key. The only parameter, the key can be a large dimensional, but it's the fundamentals of this. That's Kerckhoff principle. And that's actually the foundation of modern cryptography, that we all have to know what's the algorithm we're using, but we can keep this key or that parameter actually hidden. And that's how we decide this. So then the question was, that's what Shannon did in 1948, which is very foundational, was asking the question, what does it mean to be perfectly secure? And can we achieve perfect security or not? So if I give you a cybertext and you fail in decrypting it, does this mean it's perfectly secure? Maybe not, because maybe you're guessing something about it. Maybe you cannot fully decrypt it, but you understood something about it. So the definition of perfectly secure until 1948 was not there. It goes to Shannon. And then he used very simple model actually to decide on this. And he came up with something that's extremely foundational, two things. He defined what's perfectly secure. He showed us how to achieve perfect security. And he also convinced us that it's very, very difficult to achieve perfect security. Actually, so three things. So the model was, I have a message M. I want to send it to a destination D, which wants to figure out what was M. So that's our job. But there is this adversary W that's observing, not M, observing what you encode. So you are allowed to take M and do anything in it, but you want D to figure it out. So you cannot make it so useless such that your destination doesn't get it, but you want to do that such that W doesn't learn anything about that. So the definition that's extremely foundational, and it is actually the foundation of all provable secrecy, the quantum key distribution, all of them are based on this. It's called equivocation, which basically says, if W, before observing anything, has a certain distribution that it assumes in M. So for example, it believes M is uniformly distributed. After it sees what you transmit, that distribution needs to be still the same. So whatever you see over the channel as an adversary will not lead you to any better distribution about them. It has to remain the same. If you manage to do that, then you have perfect security. If W is able to shift its distribution about M, even to the slightest, so it was uniform, but now it shifted a little bit, thinking it's more probable this than that, then you have leaked some information. And that's the definition of equivocation, which is the foundation of all provable security, not computational, not the computational security paradigm. What he actually did as well was, if you go back to this, you'll see this link that has K, which is connecting the encoder to the decoder without actually being able, that's called a private link. So what Shannon showed is, in order to achieve perfect security, you need to have a private key, so-called private key, somehow a secure channel that the adversary has no access to it. And this private key has to have a higher throughput than the message itself. So it's if and only if. So if the private key entropy or throughput, just let's not be technical, is equal to or higher than the message, then you can achieve perfect security. If it's less, then there is no way you achieve perfect security. Right? So it's if and if only if, which is very rare in science to get an if and only if statement. So in a sense, it's a positive. Is this a positive or negative result? It's both. It's positive because he could show there is such a thing as perfect secret. We can actually achieve it. However, it's negative because reality of the matter, if you go back to this, if the private key throughput is higher than your message, why are you actually not sending your message as a private key and get it over with? If this link, if you're thinking of a communication link, if this link has a higher throughput than this, and this one is by definition not accessible to W, Why don't you just send your message here? Which is true. So in a sense, Shannon actually, after this result, he viewed it as negative, and he said, then we should give up on this private secrecy thing because we cannot do it. It doesn't matter. Like we will never have this secure link, so we need to think of something else. And actually, people thought of something else. And in the 70s, the public key cryptography revolution happened, which was actually based on a computational approach. So there was that result of Shannon, everybody knew, but everybody believed it's difficult. And of course, human beings are smart, they are innovative, they start thinking how we make it. And it was an idea from computer science, which is called the one-way function. So public key cryptography is not probably secure. It's probably secure conditioned on the hardness of certain computational problems. So if you accept, so there is this called one-way function. It's a function that's a one-to-one. So it's an invertible function. So every x goes to a unique y. However, it's a function that's easy to compute in one direction, difficult to compute in the other direction. If I gave you two very large prime numbers, you know prime numbers, 3, 5, 7, those numbers. If I gave you two very large prime numbers, you can always multiply them. That's a very easy thing. But if I gave you the product, it's very hard to figure out the two prime numbers. Now, it's unique because they are prime. So the product is uniquely, you can get the two of them uniquely, but it's very difficult. So if you accept that this problem, systems are secure. But if someone one day solve this problem, then everything breaks down. And this is why a lot of people now are interested in provable security because of the Shor factoring algorithm in quantum computing. So the Shor factoring algorithm in 1990s have shown that if you actually are operating within the quantum computing paradigm, not the classical paradigm, some problems that were believed to be very difficult are now easy to fix. So people start really worrying about all the security infrastructure because if quantum computing becomes large, widespread and large scale, we don't really still know fully what can be broken and what cannot be broken. However, even more generally, quantum computing became an example that maybe in the future we have another computing paradigm. Maybe biological computing shows that it's outside the Turing machine paradigm and we can break more. So there is more interest again in this provable security. That's what's motivating quantum key distribution. Quantum key distribution systems are supposed to be secure in an information theoretic sense. But the information theoretic sense seemed like impossible, right? But there has been progress. And the second milestone in information theoretic security happened by Wyner in 1975 or 6, I don't exactly remember the date, where he was actually the first to show we can actually use the channel, the noise in the channel to our advantage. And Wyner's idea, which is a genius idea, was in most cases, the link between the source and the destination is not just a link, it has some noise in it. And the link from the source to W also has some noise in it. So you look at this block that's called Py and YW given X, that's the new block that didn't exist in this one. We didn't have that here. So Wyner plugged in this noise and asked the question, can we actually now, first of all, I need to complete it. Wyner plugged this and remove the private thing, right? So we don't have this unrealistic private thing anymore. We just have this block that actually introduced noise, which is a model for all communications, like between me and you, now there is noise, there are reflections. If you're talking in your cell phone, there is noise and there are reflections. So the question is, what can be possible here? And he could show we can actually have perfectly secure communication if and only if the noise impairing the eavesdropper is worse than the noise impairing the legitimate receiver. And he called it the Wiretap channel. So if I have a higher level of noise, just intuitively, higher level of noise affecting the eavesdropper compared to the noise level affecting the legitimate receiver, we can always send secure communication with rates that's proportional to the difference. You basically hide your information in the noise. You send that information It sounds simplistic, but it's actually very clever and very sophisticated how to do that. But you can exploit that noise level to your advantage by hiding the information in the additional noise that the eavesdropper had. This was Wyner result. And the main limitation of Wyner result is if the wiretapper has lower noise, then we're done. You cannot hide anything. So for example, if I'm communicating on a Wi-Fi and the eavesdropper is closer to the router than you are, then the eavesdropper will have less noise and there is no way you can hide your message. That was the state of the art in early 2000 when we started, me and others, Marwan included, of course, working in this problem. And I was mostly, I can talk for myself. My own thing was, is this a fundamental limit or there is something that we can do about it if we're a little bit more careful about understanding the channel behavior? And over many years, we published a significant number of papers. What we could show is that there are actually three main principles, which I call opportunism, feedback, and cooperation, where you can actually achieve positive secrecy rates if you use the wired channel more smartly to your advantage. And I'm going to talk only about one example of them, which is opportunism. So what we have here is wired channel are a little bit different than this classical discrete channel in the so-called fading. And we try to take the simplest form of fading possible. So now we have a channel. In the classical sense, in the wireline sense, the channel has those additive noise terms. So there is some Gaussian noise impairing eavesdropper and some other Gaussian noise impairing the legitimate destination. And we added to them a very simple fading model. We just added a multiplier, the simplest fading possible. It's called flat fading. So we assume now the channel adds noise and adds a multiplicative disturbance factor. So the signal is multiplied by something. So here is something that multiplies the signal going here and another thing that's multiplying the signal. That usually comes from the reflection of the wireless signal across a lot of things. When they add up, it becomes a so-called multipass fading effect. And for the sake of simplicity, let's assume that those things are statistically identical. So no one has an edge over that. GE and GM have the same distribution. So you are not closer to the adversary is not closer to the transmitter than the destination. Same distance, same thing. So if we just, in a naive way, look at this problem from the Wyner perspective, without thinking much about it, we may be tempted to say the secrecy capacity is 0 because the two channels are identical. I don't have an edge in terms of noise. But if we start thinking a little bit deeper, then we can see while the two channels are statistically identical, they are not instantaneously identical. At some points in time, one channel will be better than the other because GM may be higher than GE and GE may be higher than GM. On average, they have the same energy, but they fluctuate. So if I am, as a transmitter, know both of them, I will pick times when my destination has a better channel than the eavesdropper and send in this differential rate. And when the eavesdropper has a better channel than me, I will stop. So basically, that's the famous logarithmic throughput. It's not really capacity throughput formula. You can look at the difference between those two. That's the gain to the legitimate receiver. That's the gain to the eavesdropper. And look at the difference between them. And whenever the difference is positive, that means you have some secrecy capacity. You can send something. And you send it. You send the differential. That's the capacity you gain. And when it's the other way around, you don't send anything. So if HM is less than HE, you don't send anything, right? Good. Then you can, as a proof of concept, you can overcome the simplistic interpretation of Wyner by just opportunistically playing this. Now, this is not fully satisfying because it assumes the transmitter knows the gain to its receiver and knows the gain to the eavesdropper, right? Now, while knowing the gain to your own receiver is reasonable because you can assume you you like each other, so you can exchange the information. Knowing the game to the eavesdropper is a little bit of a stretch because the idea from the eavesdropper that the eavesdropper doesn't really like you. So the eavesdropper will not really be collaborative and will not give you the gain and will not allow you to train because the eavesdropper is not part of this. So it was not fully satisfying to us. So the second question we asked was, what if I know only this one and I don't know this one? Can I still do something or not? And again, it's always good to start with the naive approach. If I know HM and I don't know HE, it looks like a very difficult thing because I could think that HE is lower than HM and try to send, but HE ends up to be higher than HM, and then it catches me because I don't know. But then you think a little bit, and then you discover something that's very interesting. If I know HM, and I don't know HE, I cannot hide something in every block. But if I average out over all of them and adjust my rate just to be HM, to the one that's gonna get decoded at the receiver, then what happens is everything you send, every block you send is gonna be decoded by the legitimate receiver because you are tailoring it to the legitimate receiver. But some of the blocks you send will be decoded by the adversary when HE is higher, but some will not because HE will be lower. So there will be a drop at the eavesdrop over many blocks. And you can actually figure out how many will drop. I'm simplifying, but you can actually figure out how many will drop. If you actually hide your information on average in the blocks that drop, then you can get them securely to the receiver. So again, I will never know HE, but I will send my rate just to HM. So I know, for example, was Marwan was sitting and I would just direct my rate to be barely what Marwan can decode. You're moving around. Sometimes you're closer. If you're closer, then you will get that block. But if you're farther, you will not get that block. So if I repeat this process 1,000 times, and I know your statistics, I will know how many of those 1,000 blocks you will get, how many you will drop. I don't know which ones, but I know how many they are. But because there are some of them that drop, and I know how many they are, I can be clever in my so-called coding scheme and hide my information in those blocks that drop in a very clever way. That's really genius. So what we could show, and that all goes to this plus sign here, which is basically saying you can send a rate that's equal to the difference between those two things. But if this is larger than this, we don't switch to negative because the eavesdropper will not get ever more than you because we're targeting it to you, and it becomes 0. So that term, if we didn't have a 0, if we didn't have a plus here, this expectation would be 0 because the two channels are statistically identical. So it will be positive and negative with the same distribution, and this will go to 0. But by plugging the plus here, this is always positive. And what we could show through a sophisticated binning argument is that you can actually get a non-zero capacity by knowing only your channel and channel is varying. Without knowing the channel of the eavesdropper, you just know the statistics of the channels of the eavesdropper. So that's describing what I was talking about. Yes. And this is some results actually that shows numerically, this is not simulation, those are just numerical results that shows in a symmetric case where the eavesdropper channel is identical to the main channel statistically, those two curves that meet above are the ones where you actually know both HE and HM, and the solid line is where you only know HM. So as the SNR increases, knowing only your channel gets you everything. You actually don't really need to know the eavesdropper channel. You get everything. And this 0 thing here is a naive approach that doesn't exploit this opportunity. So that was the first proof, solid proof, that you can actually get a secure capacity in a wild channel by using the fundamental characteristic of the channel. We extended this later and showed using the broadcast nature of wireless, that when you send a packet, it's received by multiple people, then you can actually still use that to your advantage. And we extended it to show also the feedback, the embedded feedback in every wireless standard, which we sometimes call ARQ, can also be used for this. So let's now switch gears a little bit to the machine learning case, which is the real name for this AI. And what we're going to consider is this case of multi-view learning. And I think ChatGPT-4, which was just released today, is supporting this multi-view, multimodal learning. So we consider a case where we have a target, and Tingway drew a rabbit, I have no idea why, but like we have a target, and you are and this target, you have data sets. It's a kangaroo, that's why. See, that's when your students or your postdoc do the thing and you are sick, you don't really get the. It's Australian, he's clever. Okay, that's good. So you have a target, the kangaroo here, and that target, you see it exhibited in different ways in different data sets. So you could have color and shape, you can have movement and speed shown in a video, you could have a text data that gives you the category and the name. So you have multimodal data sets, but it's one target. And you're trying to learn that from this so-called multiview data set. Now, that's not a terribly easy problem, because when you try to do that, you always face the so-called curse of dimensionality. If you try to merge all those things together, the dimensionality grow, and typically complexity, if you just do it straightforwardly, complexity can grow exponentially with those dimensionality, and then you cannot really do this. So usually, again, the straightforward way puts you in two extremes. You try to merge all of them, you end up with exponential complexity. Or if you're complexity limited, you just use the most dominant, you pick one of them and use it, but then you lose the potential gain you can get from all of them. Now, what we are really focused on also is the case where this data set is unlabeled. So you are learning that you don't have labels. So you don't have Y is written for you. You just have those data sets. You have the X's. That's really the case we're considering, but it's always good to start from a simple case. So if we have the labels, which was called the supervised learning case, then you basically have Y. So you have a data set, each one of them is labeled by Y, and then you have X1, X2, X4, and you can look at the joint distribution. And assuming that the noise impairing those things are independent, the joint distribution factors in this way. Now, we did a little bit of work on that last year, and basically you can really connect that problem to the so-called CEO problem, which you can show that you can find representations for each view independent of the others. So you can process X1 to give you a representation Z1, a process X4 to give you a representation Z4, and each one of them is just working with one view. So the complexity doesn't grow exponentially, and then you can collect all those back and get a good estimate for why this is the training without actually going through this exponential thing. So that's the work we published last year. The more interesting stuff that we're gonna discuss a little bit in detail here is if I take away Y. When you look at this thing here, you can see a fundamental thing in it is that independence, right? Because it factors the probability distribution. And instead of Px1 to x4 given Y, it becomes Px1 given Y, Px2 given Y, Px3. So you don't have this curse of dimensionality. But if I don't have Y, if the data set I have, if I don't know that I'm looking for a kangaroo, if I'm just getting X1, X2, X whatever, and I don't have Y, what's the solution? And the cool thing here is, again, information theory gives you a very interesting way to look at it, which is called Wyner common information. So before our work, there is work in contrastive learning and robust learning that actually came up with some heuristics for how to decouple this X. And they came up with good, reasonable results. But the complexity in those cases was always based on you take every two views together and process them, and then try to combine it then. And if you do at this problem and you look at the combinatoric, it grows exponentially as well, because of just taking every two views together, the numbers grow significantly as the number of views grow. So what we looked at is this Wyner thing. And Wyner thing is really a very interesting foundation for this. If you go back and look at the labels, the label thing was saying conditioned on why you are independent. So Wyner formulation, if I gave you two random variables, x1 and x2, Wyner question was, what's the common information between those two, x1 and x2? And he came up with this formulation that we're showing here. He said the common information, we call it Z, if it satisfies this relationship. If x1 and x2 given Z are independent, which is I x1, x2 given Z is equal to 0. So it captures all the sharedness. But it's not only that, it's the minimum mutual information between x1 and x2 and Z. That's the variable that gives you the common information. Like, because if I take x1, imagine I take Z to be the union of x1 and x2. If I take Z to be the union of x1 and x2, then I x1, x2 given Z is 0 by definition. So you start from a big Z, and you continue to shrink it. You continue to minimize I, x1, x2, and Z, maintaining this conditional independence. The minimum value of it captures the common information. Think about it. I have some observation, and some of the results will be related to modulation schemes. I send a Gaussian signal, or a modulation, and those views are multi-entangled. So the signal goes, get corrupted by the noise. Your first thinking is the common information is everything. Then you start reducing the common information. You start compressing this thing. As long as the conditional independence is satisfied, you're good. At the point where this conditional independence breaks, you lost something of the common information. So the common information, or the common information representation, Z star, is the random variable that minimizes I, x1, x2, and Z while satisfying this conditional independence. And of course, that's the distribution you know. This is all what you're given, so you have to satisfy this as well. So Z is a fictitious variable. It's a variable that you're going to create. It's not the label. It's a representation that you're going to create, but you're going to create it to satisfy those things. And this one is the conditional independence. Now, the problem, of course, is this is a non-convex optimization, so solving it is not trivial. So we started to think a little bit, how are we going to solve this in a computationally efficient way? So the first thing we did was to relax this a little bit by saying, I will create another distribution, which I call P theta of x1 and x2. That second distribution satisfies the conditional independence, not the original one. But I will make sure the KL divergence between the distribution I'm given and the fictitious distribution I have is less than epsilon. Like if you put epsilon 0 here, you get the original problem that we started with. But we relax it a little bit, so we allow ourselves some, when similar to if you have experience with integer programming, right? So integer programming is very difficult. So you relax it. You say, I'm not going to impose the integer constraint. I'm going to make it something that's easier, solve it, and then project it down. So that's what we're trying to do here. But you have to be smart about the way you relax. So we relax it a little bit and try to solve it. And that really got us somewhere. But then we still have a problem that we are never given that thing. You are given data, right? You are giving data set. You get in x1 and x2. You're never given a probability distribution. You're just given data set. And computing a probability distribution, disjoint probability distribution from the data set is really difficult. Then we take one more step, which is variational inference. We say, instead of really computing px1 and x2, we're going to look at this q given z x1 or the pz given x1 and x2, and assume actually it falls within a certain class of distribution. And find the one in this class of distribution instead of finding the best one. So we restrict ourselves more, but if you're smart about picking that class of distribution, you don't lose much here. So instead of trying to get into the equation, maybe this is good. So that figure is good. So you receive x1 and x2. The first thing you do is you form a log likelihood function. It's always good to operate in the log domain. And then the softmax is basically an estimate for your representation. So you compute a softmax, which is the minimum energy thing, like an estimator for this. And after you compute this representation, you form from it your approximation of the distribution of x1 and x2. And then you feed that back and compare it with your original data, and the loss feeds forward. So if you are doing a very good job, and if Z is becoming a good representation, this loss is very small, and then you will stop. It's like a gradient descent. So you feed back the loss, and the idea again is, if I'm getting close to the common information, the distribution that I'm going to generate here, which is conditionally independent, is a very good approximation of the original distribution. And you iterate this and you see what you got. And then you pick Z star that has the minimum entropy, or the smallest Z star that allows this loss function to be small. Please. Different observation. That's absorbed here, right? So whatever they are, just transform them into log likelihood. Once they are in log likelihood, you're operating in the one domain now. And you get from that an estimate. After you get an estimate for this D star, you recreate the distribution and you compare the distribution you created by the original one. If they are close, the iteration will saturate. If they are large, that tells you made a mistake here, and this will be large, and then you will pick another one. And you go through your data this one. And after you find D star, you shrink it, and you try again. And you look at the loss. And at the point where after shrinking, you start seeing the loss grow, that means this is the minimum representation that you need. Yes, sir. No, you don't have labels. The data set has no labels. This is unsupervised. Yes. Yes. Right. 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 Yes, I get what you're saying. Yeah, no, you will get it. You don't have to know it. This figures it out for you. I'll show you them. This figures it out for you. So if you're you don't know how many cards there are, you just know cards, right? Yes, it will get you the right number of cards. How you do it? That happens here. You created, you assume this is the common information, you assume that's the card, and you create it by injecting noise. And compare it back. And we applied that in Gaussian distribution, like if you have a wireless channel, we applied it in Bernoulli distribution. So if you have binary data, we applied it in Poisson distribution. So the nature of the distribution only changes the log likelihood. The architecture remains the same, you just compute a different log likelihood. We call it the Wyner variational autoencoder. So this is the case where it's used for demodulation, blind demodulation. Imagine the scenario where you have a transmitter that's using a constellation, you don't know its size, you don't know the channel, you don't know anything. You just know there is a constellation being used that's discrete. You don't know the mean, you don't know the variance, you just know that there is a constellation. That curve shows the difference between ML, which knows everything, and this thing that doesn't know anything. So it gets you as close to ML as possible without actually any assumption. So you don't know the constellation size, you don't know the constellation point, you don't know the channel coefficient, and you compare it with the case where you know all of those. And that's answering the question of the number of cards. If you imagine the cardinality of Z to be the number of cards, so you start with assuming there is a lot of cards. So every card can be more than one. And the loss would be 0. And then you keep coming down, coming down, coming down. When you hit the right numbers, the loss will start growing. So that becomes the number of cars or the number of classes you have. So you repeat it, you start with something big, because every car you can think of it as 2. It doesn't matter. Still a bad loss. It's still a 0 loss. You shrink, you shrink, you shrink. Once you hit the right number, you try to shrink more, the loss will increase because you will miss some of it. That's it. And that one is, as the number of views increase, both of them go down, the ML and the Wyner. And that's an example we use for image. So what we did here is we created a data set. We created a data set, the MNIST data set, and we coupled the digits in English or in Arabic, whatever you want to call it, and Chinese. So every view is the same digit, but in a different language. And we wanted to classify them. So one data set would be 2 views. You would see 0, and you would see this thing, or you see a 7, and you see this thing. So those are the 2 views. So you have a data set that's in multi-language, basically, and we use them to classify. And this is actually the result of the existing stuff. And that's the result we got from our scheme. And that's a scheme, it's a little bit better if you start using it's a semi-supervised. So if there is a little bit of labels here, so this is as the number of labels available like a semi-supervised setting. So the message here is this Wyner approach allows you to ground this multi-view learning in a solid information theoretic principle without having any label. Now, the last thing I want to leave you with is the connection between those two worlds, the cyber and the AI. The example we did in the confidentiality, it's all thinking at one layer of the stack. Some of you may be familiar, or all of you, with the stack, the communication stack, the 7 layers. One of the big limitations of all cybersecurity work or all vulnerability detection work is that you think of it, it's always in one layer. So there is the work I described now, it's in the physical layer, but there is work at the application layer, there's work at the network layer. So I had a colleague actually who was doing this work at the application layer, which was looking at side channel attack. So he was looking at information that's fully encrypted, probably secure. He didn't try to break the encryption. But what he could find out is just doing traffic analysis at the application layer, you could tell a lot of things about the communication. So for example, if it's a video streaming, if you're using Netflix, the traffic pattern itself, the spacing between the packets and the jitter is different from YouTube. In fact, you could actually do it without decrypting or anything up to the video ID. So he could identify the video ID just by observing the traffic pattern at the application layer with some accuracy. But that's only limited to the application. Now, the hypothesis we started with, think of every layer as a view in a machine learning scenario. And every layer has a signature from the user. So the communication puts a signature on that. So for example, at the application layer, the traffic pattern is a signature that could be different from a different video or a different user. One user, for example, may be watching news in the morning, streaming videos at night. One other user may be doing it at 5 p.m. So the user behavior leaves a signature at the application layer. The device itself leaves a signature at the physical layer. The IQ imbalance in the device, called fingerprint, leave a signature at the physical layer. The MAC layer has a signature. So every layer has a signature. Every layer should be tied to one view in our AI model, right? And now we can do 2 things. We can look at attackers or adversaries that actually have access to this information leakage from the layer and try to do a multi-layer attack and understand more the vulnerability if you're not only limited to one layer. And we can do the other way around. We can use this multi-layer information in a multi-layer authentication. So for example, in the RF fingerprinting, people try to use the device as an authentication. So every IQ imbalance is a little bit unique. So maybe we can identify the user based on that. But what if we try to identify the user based on that and their pattern of behavior at the application layer or the content they're watching? So what we are doing is basically trying to create this multi-layer security stack for exposing vulnerability and ensuring security primitive by tying every layer with a view in the multi-layer scheme. And that's a comparison we just did 2 weeks ago in a paper that we're going to submit the end of this week, comparing the case where you're only using traffic and the case where you're combining traffic with channel state information identification. So you have this learning algorithm. One view is the traffic at the application layer, and the other view is the CSI at the physical layer. And you're trying to combine them to identify the user. And as you can see, the identification accuracy grows as from using one layer to the multi-layer thing. So in summary, I think, or I believe, information theory gives us a set of rigorous tools where we can actually do what engineers like to do. We can build efficient algorithms, but at the same time, without really having to do hand waving. When those things work, they work for good reasons. You can get provable guarantees, and even if you cannot get provable guarantees, at least there is a conceptual reason why they work. When the multi-view learning based on Wyner information work, it's not surprising because it's foundationally sound from a principled approach. So you can combine the two things. In this security world, I believe the future is this multi-layer. This multi-layer thing balances two things. One, it keeps the layers because the layers are important. They allow modularity, they allow a lot of good things. But it allows you to combine the information in the layers. You don't have to live in one of them. You can actually see this across multiple of them and do good stuff. So I actually think information theorists will be able to have fun in this area moving forward, and hopefully some of you will join. Thank you for your time. It was a pleasure, and I'll be happy to answer questions. That's good. Yes. Yes. You are right. This is actually because you don't know why. There's nothing to maximize. That's why the conditional independence come in. That's really the innovation here. If you had why, then you maximize. That's information bottleneck. If you know why, if you had the access to the label, then you will do Z and maximize I, Z, Y and minimize it, right? But I don't know this. So instead of this, I make them conditionally independent. That's the trick. Yes. Yes. This is not complex at all. So the application layer stuff that Kanchana did, he actually has a prototype for it in IoT. What we're trying to do right now, we have the simulation, but in terms of prototype, we are basically saying, take every one of them and just combine them at the machine learning level. So it doesn't change much of what's going on. It's not complex at all. Not yet. Not yet. Simulation, we don't have a prototype. The application layer stuff, the traffic analysis is implemented in a prototype, but that's prior to my involvement in the work. Yes. You mean how the complexity scales with the view? Yeah, how long it will take to answer? It's very effective. I mean, We don't have results in how long, but we know it grows linearly with the number of views. Yeah. Yes. You cannot say, yeah, so we show that's not sufficient, but you need to know some bounds. Just the type of distribution is not sufficient. Because if you, for example, you can easily see there is an extreme case where it's 0, if the person is just very close. But if you have some boundary on it, like for example, in situations like this, you can say the eavesdropper cannot be inside the building. They can only be outside. And if they come outside, of course, they can become with a bigger antenna. But you can limit the size of antenna, then you get something. But if you say they can really be in my pocket, you know something. You really know something. But if you go to the extreme case and say that person is going to reside in my pocket, then there's nothing we can do. Yes. Exactly. Exactly. That's it. Exactly. Yes. Well, so I don't think there will be perfect secrecy in public key cryptography. I think there will be, like now there is post-quantum crypto that takes the classical model and expand it to the quantum model and say, given what we know about the quantum model, these problems are still difficult. Now, the danger with all of this is there can always be in the future another quantum. What quantum taught us basically is Turing machine is not the end. There are other things. And we have no clarity where it ends. There are no converse that says there are no computational models ever that will do something. That's not there. That's why this people, at least outside the US, they are not really excited about, but outside the US, they're excited about quantum key distribution, because at least in quantum key distribution, if you know you have a direct optical link, then there's nothing anyone can do about it. But that's a little bit questionable. I actually, to be honest, I'm not really obsessed about provable secrecy. I think it's just a rigorous tool to play the game. Because when you have to understand it, and ultimately it's a game between the legitimates and adversaries. It's how much resource you're willing to put to protect against one. But you need to be aware of that. And that's what provable gives you. To give you those rigorous measures of, yes, if you invest $1 billion, then the adversary has to invest a pie. That's what you really end up doing. Because if you really, really want, like Marwan mentioned, I was a CEO of my company, like, and Windows hacks, you know what I do for our customers to be perfectly secure? We take a copy of our system and it's offline. So there is no, I always make sure there is a hard disk copy of the customer data that's not connected to anything. This way, if the worst case scenario, you can always go back to this thing. So it's always about this game, but you really need rigorous tools to really know where you are. Reality is when you look at RSA or all of those things, all of those problems, if someone solves it tomorrow, they will never tell us. They can make much more money just figuring out what we're sending without telling it. So the rigorous statement is those problems for public key cryptography are known to be difficult in the public domain. In the private domain, you never know, because no one came with a proof and says factoring large prime is impossible. So it's a little bit tricky. Any other questions? Okay, thank you again. It was a pleasure talking to you.